April the 20th, 1914, southern Colorado, a place of open high plains and bare, cold foothills. And on a patch of open ground, there is a small city made entirely of tents, rows of white canvas, around 1,200 people living inside them, coal miners and their families. Immigrants, most of them, Greek, Italian, Mexican, Serbian, men who went down into the earth every single day, their wives, their children. They had been living in those tents through the whole of a Colorado winter, because months earlier they had gone on strike, and the company that owned their homes had thrown them out. So they built a town of canvas at the mouth of the canyon, and they waited. What did they want? Not very much. To be paid honestly for the coal they dug, an 8-hour day, the right to see a doctor who did not work for the company, to shop at a store the company did not own. The simplest things. They had asked for years, and no one had listened. And on that April morning, the men with guns came. The state militia set a machine gun on the ridge above the camp, and they opened fire. All day long, the bullets poured down into the tents, and when it grew dark, the tents began to burn. Now, beneath one of the largest tents, a family had dug a pit, a cellar in the earth, to hide the women and the children from the shooting. When the tent above them caught fire, they were trapped. 2 women and 11 children, 13 people who suffocated to death in a hole in the ground beneath a burning tent. The youngest was a baby, barely 3 months old. They had all come to America for a better life. So whose mine were they striking against? A company called Colorado Fuel and Iron. And Colorado Fuel and Iron belonged to one family, the richest family in the entire world. Their name, Rockefeller. The same Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, who, out of a bookkeeper's desk in Cleveland, had built Standard Oil, the largest oil empire the world had ever seen. At its peak, it controlled around 90% of all the oil in America. 90%. He was the world's first billionaire. By one measure, the richest man in the entire modern history of the world. No American fortune, before him or since, not Carnegie, not Ford, not Gates, not Bezos, not Musk, ever held so large a share of the nation's wealth. And here is the strange, terrible knot at the very heart of this story. He built the biggest empire on earth, in oil, but the blood, the 2 women and 11 children in that burning pit, was on his coal. This is that man's story, and it is not a simple one. It cannot be held inside a single frame. There is a rise in it that is genuinely astonishing, and there is a chapter in it that cannot be looked away from. That is exactly what World's Richest is for, the whole story of every great empire, the parts we celebrate and the parts that make us deeply uncomfortable. If this is your first time here, subscribe. It is completely free. And today, the whole story, from the very beginning to that pit in the snow. So let's go back, all the way back, 1839, a small town in New York State. John Davison Rockefeller is born, the second of 6 children. His father was a con man, a traveling salesman of fake medicine who called himself a doctor and who often vanished for months at a time. His mother was a devout, disciplined Baptist, and young John took after her, entirely. He was quiet, serious, careful, and obsessed, above all else, with numbers. At 16, he took his first job, an assistant bookkeeper in Cleveland, Ohio, and he loved it. He loved the ledger, the neat columns, the exactness of money. From his very first paycheck, he did 2 things. He saved a part of it, and he gave a part of it away to his church, writing down every single cent in a little book. Discipline and God, the 2 poles of his whole life. He was not a gambler. He was not a dreamer. He was a bookkeeper who would one day be building the largest business on earth, and he counted every barrel of it. By 20, he had his own small business, trading grain and hay and meat. And then came the American Civil War. The army needed food, and Rockefeller sold it to them and grew rich enough to go looking for something far bigger. He found it in oil. In those years, a strange new thing had started coming out of the ground in Pennsylvania: crude oil. Refined, it became kerosene, the fuel that lit the lamps of America in the years before electricity. Everyone was drilling for it. It was chaos. Prices crashed and soared and crashed again. Most men chased the drilling, the gamble, the gusher. Rockefeller did something colder and smarter. He ignored the wells entirely, and instead, he took over the refining, the one narrow gate that every barrel of oil in the country had to pass through. In 1870, he founded a company. He called it Standard Oil. And then, quietly, patiently, he set out to own all of it. His method was ruthless. He made secret deals with the railroads. They gave him lower shipping rates than anyone else, and, in the most astonishing part of all, they paid him a cut of the freight that his own competitors paid. Every single barrel a rival shipped put money into Rockefeller's pocket. With that hidden weapon, he walked into the office of one Cleveland refiner after another, and he made each of them the same offer. Sell to me now, take Standard Oil stock, and your family will never know want. Or refuse me, and I will crush you. In about 6 weeks, he swallowed most of his rivals in the city. People called it the Cleveland Massacre. It would not, as it turned out, be the last thing of his that was called a massacre. Within a decade, Standard Oil controlled around 90% of all the oil in America. Rockefeller had not just won the game, he had bought the board it was played on, and he did not stop at the refineries. He bought the pipelines, the barrel makers, the tank cars, the warehouses, every link in the chain, from the well in the ground to the lamp on your kitchen table, until there was no part of it left that he did not touch. In 1882, he bound it all together into something entirely new, a trust, a single hidden hand controlling 40 companies at once. It was so new and so feared that the word for it, trust, gave its name to every law written since to break up monopolies. Antitrust. He is the reason the word exists. For a while, America let him. Oil was cheap. The lamps were lit. But then, people began to look at the cost of it. A journalist named Ida Tarbell, whose own father had been ruined by Standard Oil, spent years documenting exactly how Rockefeller had done it. The secret deals, the spying, the threats. She laid it all out, page after page, for the whole country to read. And the country turned on him. Rockefeller became the most hated businessman in America, the living face of the monopoly. And in 1911, the Supreme Court agreed with his enemies. It ruled that Standard Oil was an illegal monopoly, and it ordered the whole thing broken apart into more than 30 separate companies. It should have been his ruin. Instead, it made him richer than any human being had ever been, because he owned a piece of every one of those 30 companies. And once they were split free of one another, their value soared. Around 1913, his fortune reached its peak. And a few years after that, he became, as far as anyone has ever been able to measure it, the first billionaire in the history of the world. And now, an old, gaunt man, gone hairless from illness, worth more than entire nations, set out to change the way the world saw him. He gave. On a scale no one ever had before, he built a great university in Chicago. He founded institutes that would go on to fight hookworm and yellow fever, that would reshape modern medicine itself, and that would save in time more lives than anyone can count. That was real. It genuinely happened. And right alongside it, a gentler picture was being painted. The frugal, pious old man who taught Sunday school, who lived simply, and who, wherever he went, handed out shiny new dimes. A dime for a grown man, a nickel for a child, a tiny coin, and a folksy smile. God, he liked to say, gave me my money. This was the picture of John D. Rockefeller that America was slowly learning to accept. The kindly old grandfather with the shining dimes. And it is right at this moment, while that picture was still being painted, that we have to turn away from the oil and go to Colorado and to coal. Because the Rockefeller fortune did not sit still in oil. Around 1902, the family bought control of a company far from the oil fields, Colorado Fuel and Iron, coal and steel. It owned the mines and the mountains they were carved out of across the south of Colorado. It was the single largest employer in the whole region, and by this time, the old man, Rockefeller Sr., had retired from active business. The man now in charge of the family's companies was his only son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., a shy, dutiful man who ran the coal empire from an office in New York, more than 1,000 miles away. He had never once, in his life, set foot inside the mines. Now, understand what those mines actually were. They were not simply workplaces. They were kingdoms. The company owned the town. It owned the houses the miners slept in, the store where they bought their food, the doctor, the school, the saloon, even the church. A miner was paid in the company's own money, and he spent it in the company's own stores. One historian called it a feudal domain. The company was the lord, and the miners were the subjects, and the work itself killed them. In Colorado, a coal miner was more than twice as likely to die on the job as anywhere else in America. In one single year, over 100 of them died, and often, the men were not even paid for the most dangerous work of all, the work of shoring up the tunnels so that the mine would not collapse down onto their own heads. They called that unpaid labor, dead work, and the men resented it more than almost anything else. You could die doing the very work that kept you alive, and be paid nothing at all for it. So, in the autumn of 1913, they had finally had enough. Thousands of miners walked out, on strike, and their demands were not radical: to have their union recognized, to be paid honestly by the true weight of the coal they dug, the 8-hour day that the law had already promised them, the right to choose their own doctor, their own store, the right, simply, to be treated as men and not as property. The company's answer was one word: no. And then it evicted them. It threw them and their wives and their children out of the company houses into the coming winter. So the union rented open land and it handed out tents. And the miners built their towns of canvas at the mouths of the canyons, the largest of them, at a little railroad stop called Ludlow. 1,200 people, 200 tents, and they dug in to wait the company out. But the company did not wait quietly. It hired private detectives, armed guards, and it built an armored car mounting a machine gun and a searchlight. The miners gave it a name: the Death Special. At night, the guards would drive it slowly past the tents, sweeping the searchlight across the canvas, and firing, at random, into the dark. When an old woman came to rally the strikers, an organizer known all across America simply as Mother Jones, the authorities locked her away for weeks, just to silence her, and as the violence grew, the governor called out the state militia. At first, the soldiers seemed to be keeping the peace, but then the state's money ran out. Most of the real soldiers were sent home, and what was left behind, still wearing the uniform of the state, were the company's own hired guards. Men paid by Rockefeller's company, now dressed as soldiers of Colorado. And that is who was standing on the ridge above Ludlow on the morning of April the 20th. It began with a machine gun and 2 dynamite bombs set off as a signal. And then, for 14 hours, the militia fired down into the tent colony. The families ran. Some hid inside the tents. Some fled out across the open ground, under the bullets, running for the hills. A slow freight train, passing on the tracks, blocked the line of fire for a few minutes. And in those few minutes, many people escaped with their lives. But not all of them. As the sun went down, the tents were set alight. The Union said the soldiers soaked them in kerosene and burned them deliberately. The company said they simply caught fire in the fighting. But burn they did. And beneath the largest tent of all was that pit, the cellar where the women and children had been hiding from the guns. When the fire came down on top of them, they could not get out. 2 women, 11 children, 13 people, gone. A telephone repairman found their bodies the next morning, and the leader of the whole camp, a Greek immigrant named Louis Tikas, who had spent that entire day trying to save his people, was captured by the soldiers. An officer broke a rifle across his skull, and then they shot him, in the back. His body was left lying beside the railroad tracks for 3 days. When the news of it got out, the miners went half mad with grief and with rage. They took up their own guns, and for 10 days, the whole of southern Colorado became a war. Miners attacked mine after mine along 40 miles of country, burning the buildings, killing the guards. Dozens more people died. It stopped only when the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, sent in the Federal Army to take the guns away from both sides at once. And the strike itself dragged on for months more, and then it simply collapsed. The miners, out of money, out of food, went back to work. With nothing, no union, not one single one of their demands met. Hundreds of them were arrested and charged with murder. And the soldiers? The men who fired the machine gun, who burned the tents, who killed Luis Ticas, not one of them spent a single day in prison. But something else happened too. The country wanted to know who was truly responsible, and the trail led east, to New York, to a single office building, number 26, Broadway, to the Rockefellers. They were summoned before the United States government to answer for it, and what the son had said before the killings was now read back to him out loud. Just 2 weeks before Ludlow, John D. Rockefeller Jr. had been asked, under oath, whether he would stand by the company's refusal to recognize the union, even if it cost him every last piece of his property and the lives of every one of his employees. And he had answered that yes, he would, that it was a great principle. 2 weeks after he said those words, 13 women and children lay dead in a pit, and the old man, Rockefeller Sr. himself, when he was later asked whether he would have acted to prevent it, knowing that guards in his own pay were capable of such a thing, answered plainly that he would have taken no action at all. It was an honest answer, and a chilling one. From more than 1,000 miles away, the men who owned that mine had felt none of the fire. Now, a lesser family might simply have been destroyed by this. The Rockefellers did something new instead, something the world had not quite seen before. They did not only defend themselves, they hired a man to change the story itself. His name was Ivy Lee, and he is remembered today as one of the fathers of an entire industry, public relations. Lee flooded the country with pamphlets, carefully worded, mailed directly to the powerful, telling the company's side of it. And some of what they contained was simply false. His critics gave him a nickname that stuck to him for good, Poison Ivy. The family then hired a second man, a future Prime Minister of Canada, to design a brand new plan for the miners. On paper, it gave the workers a voice. In truth, it was a union controlled by the company itself, built very deliberately to keep the real union out. And then, the masterstroke of the whole thing, the shy son John Jr., the man who had never once visited the mines in his life, was sent out to Colorado to walk through the camps, to shake the miners' hands, to sit down inside their homes, and, for the cameras, to dance with the miners' wives. The photographs traveled all around the country, the cold, distant man from New York, reborn overnight as a friend of the working man, and it worked. It is studied, to this day, as one of the very first great acts of corporate damage control. Before Ludlow, a company in trouble simply stayed silent and waited for the storm to pass. After Ludlow, it learned to fight for the story, to shape it, to sell it back to the public as something else. That is a weapon still used on us today. The Rockefellers had learned the final lesson of scale. When you are big enough, you do not only own the oil and the coal and the railroads, you can also, with enough money and enough cleverness, buy back the story of what you did. So, how are we meant to hold this one man? Because both of these things are completely true. John D. Rockefeller was a genuine genius, a poor bookkeeper's son who built the modern oil industry out of almost nothing, who brought cheap light into millions of homes, and whose fortune, once he gave it away, built universities and cured diseases and saved more human lives than we are able to count. The man who had crushed his rivals without a flicker of mercy spent his final decades trying to heal the world, perhaps to be remembered, perhaps to be forgiven. All of that is real, but Ludlow is also real, exactly as real. Those 13, the 2 women, and the 11 children in that pit, their names appear in no history of Standard Oil. They are carved onto none of the great buildings his money paid for. Their families buried them and then grew old in that same valley, living in the shadow of what had happened there. And here is the lesson that comes out of this entire story. When a company grows large enough, the weight of its every decision grows just as large. When a man is powerful enough to say, under oath, that the deaths of all of his workers would be a fair price to pay for a principle, then the distance between that man and that pit becomes the whole problem. Following the law is an argument you make in a hearing room. It is not the same thing as having a conscience. Compliance is not safety. And with scale, with all of that power, accountability is supposed to grow to match it. That is the lesson. And it is the one part of this story that the whole machine of pamphlets and dimes and photographs was built to make us forget. The Rockefeller name is still, today, almost everywhere. On foundations, on a great university, on a whole center in the very heart of New York City. The fortune he built reshaped medicine and science and the very idea of giving all across the world. And it also, out in Colorado, helped invent the modern art of burying a scandal. But out there, on those high plains, there is still a small stone monument to 13 women and children who died in a hole in the ground beneath a burning tent, striking against the richest family on the face of the earth. Their story is in no ledger, on no list of the world's richest men. And that is exactly why it is worth telling, because when a man builds the single greatest fortune in modern history, the real questions are the ones the annual reports never answer. Where did all of it come from? What did it cost? And who, exactly, paid that cost? Whose voice was heard, and whose was silenced and burned? That is what World's Richest does. Not only the success, the whole picture. If tonight's story made you stop and think, then subscribe. And send it on to someone who wants the real story behind the great fortunes. Not just the shining half of it, but all of it. We will see you with another one very soon.